Today's topic is automation in video games. We'll be teasing apart this subject as it pertains to real-time strategy games, but the primary goal of this video is to define a working model for discerning when automation is positive and when it's going a step too far. The first and most important point we'll make about automation is that the instinct to employ it is often a sign of poor design. If you as a designer cannot find a good reason for players to ever engage with a mechanic, automation might be useful, or you might just have to remove or rework the mechanic from the ground up. Still, some decisions are best automated, such as the act of repeatedly reissuing harvest orders. This doesn't test the skills we're looking for in an RTS game, but it does consume a large quantity of attention that the player could use to make more interesting choices and to express more relevant skills. Based on our heuristic, keeping this action manual would do more harm than good to the game flow. So assuming we don't want to remove harvesting from the game, automation is an appropriate recourse. But let's pause for a moment to mull over the potential results of broad automation. When you remove or reduce manual control, you also remove or reduce player choice, the key ingredients necessary to test for player skill. Automate too many mechanics, or just one very important mechanic, and you risk rendering your entire game disinteresting and bereft of player agency. As a quick example of what should stay manual, you wouldn't want to automate unit production in a game that is about composing a varied army of distinct combatants, because it works directly against one of the premises of the game. And if you felt compelled to automate some aspect of unit production, you should instead consider what part of it feels strategically barren. Consistency in the user experience is paramount to creating a game that feels complete. So rather than arbitrarily gimmicking one instance of a mechanic as important as unit production, work to improve such essential systems until all of their instances function as intended. Luckily for us, we have an example of inconsistency through automation, so let's examine that. Dylan Kahn, creative lead at Sunspear Games, wrote about worker production in their forthcoming title, Immortal Gates of Pyre. I'll read the important bits aloud, but the full image will be on screen and linked in the description. Quote, "A rote task is a task that offers little strategic benefit, and is simply a task that one must remember to do, regardless of circumstance, or they fall behind or lose outright. Our design centers around opt-in complexity, where we reduce, mitigate, or eliminate rote tasks while preserving or enhancing their strategic value." A good example would be worker production. In StarCraft, players must make workers or fall behind and die, and prioritize this skill early on in order to have a chance at participating in the true experience that StarCraft offers. Other RTS titles try to eliminate workers in order to make their game more accessible, but that kills an entire dimension of gameplay. Worker-based economies are fundamentally more interactive and exciting than number-goes-up economic models. We have workers, saturation, and pulls, but we have worker production set to a default toggle on with a lot of good, smart base AI. This means low-skill players get to have a real economy to make an army, but high-skill players can toggle off worker production to hit a timing, or enable a particular build order. End quote. With deference to the fact that this is a reply on the Immortal Discord server, as opposed to a more official statement from the developers, there are a lot of implicit assumptions that seem to guide Kahn towards Sunspear's final decision. As stated before, automation can carry very unsavory consequences when done poorly or overzealously, so it should only be considered as a sort of last resort for when all attempts at making the mechanic interesting in skill testing have come up short. As a result, you would hope that developers would carefully consider any decision to automate important mechanics within a genre. Kahn initially writes about rote tasks, which sounds pretty similar to what we've discussed so far. He frames the discussion around worker production in a peculiar light by describing these rote tasks as having little strategic benefit. In reality, this description would be far more applicable to the macro mechanics of StarCraft 2, where you must literally push a button on cooldown to call down mules or to inject larvae, lest you fall behind an opponent who does the same thing. With such an advantage intrinsic to the action, and with virtually no opportunity cost, there is no actual choice here, a clear case of a rote task that could be removed or automated with nothing of value being lost. With macro mechanics as a test case, we can illustrate why worker production does not qualify. Unlike with injecting larvae, there are tangible and varied opportunity costs to training workers. Resources that could have been used for structures or combat units, time that could have been spent performing another function of the town center, and attention that could have been directed towards repositioning armies or reacting to an opponent's move. StarCraft II's macro mechanics exclusively test for attention to timings, since they provide so many benefits that easily supersede the value of competing abilities. Sunspear, meanwhile, have seemingly removed supply costs for workers, but preserved resource and time costs, and simply automated away the need for a player's attention. The question must be asked: does Khan not believe that an RTS ought to test for player skill, in judiciously spending resources, choosing one of a structure's functions over others, or adeptly splitting focus between economic and army management? The idea of opt-in complexity is supposed to split the difference between welcoming new players and maintaining skill-based choices for grizzled veterans. But training wheels like these rarely function as intended in games. They instill bad patterns of play, teaching newcomers incorrect lessons about what constitutes good and poor gameplay. At best, they are non-invasive and ignorable, and at worst, they require actively unlearning lower-quality methods in order to learn what players could have been taught to begin with. This deployment of automated worker production seems more like the latter, but the silliest part about it all is that this doesn't even change the end result where skilled players are concerned. All it does is get in the way of greenhorns forming proper habits. Here's the deeper question. If worker production seems so rote and devoid of strategic impact, could it be that the problem is with the game state and not with the action itself? What would happen if players actually had to make a choice about when to train a worker and when to save their money? Khan is aware that this will be a case, otherwise there would be no reason to ever toggle off the automation. But for some reason, the penny still hasn't dropped. If you feel inclined to automate early game worker production, your early game might be what needs work. Stepping away from Immortal, let's consider a mechanic that could be automated, but would benefit more from being heavily reworked or simply removed instead. Supply. Engaging with supply is not a mere repetitive chore with little to no strategic implications, but building supply structures does lead to silly situations where a player has invested thousands of resources into production arms, only to have them rendered unusable because a few cheap facilities were destroyed in a completely different part of the map. If you want to make supply work well in an RTS, you have to weigh how to resolve its most ugly edge cases, and we have chosen to omit it from our titles instead. It feels tautologous to say it aloud, but it's simply far better to revise or remove mechanics that don't contribute positively to your intended game flow. This is especially true when you set out to make a competitive game, as one of the central pillars of such games is testing player skill, and it is your responsibility as a designer to decide what skills to test. Don't take half measures when it comes to something so core to what your game is meant to be, and consider carefully any urge to automate away something that might simply be better off overhauled or left behind. Until next time.